This will destroy every Australian family's future, and there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. Right now, as we speak, Australia is experiencing the largest wealth transfer in its history. From young to old, from renters to landlords, from Australians to foreign investors. An entire generation is being locked out of the prosperity their parents took for granted. The average Australian house now costs 9 times what people earn. Rent takes up 1/3 of most families' income. Young couples are choosing between having children or having a home. And it's about to get so much worse. Because what's coming isn't just unaffordable housing, it's economic devastation on a scale Australia has never seen. A perfect storm of foreign debt, demographic collapse, and political failure that will leave millions of families financially ruined. The lucky country? More like the last country. The last developed nation to realize it sold its future to the highest bidder. Australia's economic destruction isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. And when you see the numbers, you'll understand why this collapse is far worse than anyone dares to admit. Let's start with the lie that's been sold to every Australian. On paper, Australia looks incredible. The second highest median wealth per adult in the world. $268,000 each, roughly $410,000 Australian. Roughly 1 in 10 Australians is a millionaire in US dollar terms. The country that lifted 800 million Chinese out of poverty by selling them iron ore and coal. But here's the catch. Most Australians can't actually access this wealth. More than 53% of household assets are tied up in real estate values. Another massive chunk sits in superannuation accounts that people can't touch until they're nearly dead. Strip away the housing bubble and forced retirement savings, and Australia's prosperity looks far less impressive. The reality? Australia's per capita GDP growth over the last decade was a meager 1.1% annually, near the bottom among developed nations. Real wages have been flat or falling when adjusted for the cost of living. Productivity growth is anemic. Australians feel wealthy on paper, but broke in practice. And that's exactly how the system was designed. But wait until you see what's really powering this fake prosperity. Australia rode a commodity boom to wealth, but at a devastating cost. In 2023, the country ranked 105th in the world for economic complexity, below Uganda and Senegal. That's not a typo. Australia had the least sophisticated economy of any developed nation, relying almost entirely on digging stuff out of the ground and shipping it overseas. This is the economic profile of a colonial outpost, not a modern nation. But here's where it gets truly shocking. Australia doesn't even own its own resources anymore. 86% of Australia's mining industry is now foreign-owned. BHP, supposedly Australia's mining giant, is 76% foreign-owned. Rio Tinto, 83% foreign-owned. Together, they control 70% of Australia's listed mining resources. Chinese, American, and European corporations extract Australia's non-renewable wealth and send the profits offshore. Australians get the environmental damage and a few temporary mining jobs. The real money flows to foreign shareholders. When Australia tried to tax mining super profits in 2012, the foreign-funded industry lobby destroyed the policy overnight. Since then, governments have been too terrified to seriously tax the company strip mining their country. The result? Over $455 billion in mining export revenue in 2022-2023, but most of the wealth extracted and sent abroad. Australia, the rich country that stays poor. And the commodity dependence creates a ticking time bomb. When China's growth slows or commodity prices slash, Australia has nothing else to fall back on. Manufacturing is dead, the tech sector is tiny. The economy would simply collapse. Already, warning signs are flashing. As China's growth cooled in recent years, Australia's per capita growth flatlined. The engine is sputtering. But if you think that's bad, wait until you see what's happening to housing. In the 1970s and 80s, Australia had one of the highest home ownership rates in the world. Houses were affordable. Young families could buy homes on single incomes. Then came the Great Australian Housing Scam. Since the 1970s, house prices have exploded by over 3,400%, while wages rose only 80 to 100% in real terms. Sydney's median house price is now 13 to 15 times median household income, worse than New York, London, or San Francisco. The result? An entire generation locked out of home ownership. The average first-time buyer is now 36 years old and rising. 3 in 5 renters, 60%, expect to rent for life and never own a home. Australia's home ownership rate, once near 70%, is projected to fall below 63%. But here's the truly insidious part. This wasn't an accident. It was engineered. Australia's tax system massively incentivizes property speculation through negative gearing, a policy that lets wealthy investors write off rental property losses against their income tax. At its peak, over 1 million taxpayers used this loophole to reduce their taxes while bidding up house prices. Capital gains on properties held more than a year get a 50% tax discount. Foreign investors poured billions into Australian real estate, $15 billion in 2023 alone. The government only banned foreign purchases of existing homes in 2025 after the damage was done. The result? Investment properties sitting empty across Australian cities while families crowd into overpriced rentals. Housing became a speculative commodity for the wealthy, not shelter for families. Even the Reserve Bank admits the housing market is a risk to financial stability, one of the biggest bubbles in the world. What happens when it pops? Heavily indebted households default. Banks absorb massive losses. Consumer spending collapses. Construction industries tank. It would make 2008 look like a gentle correction. Yet, meaningful reform remains impossible. Too many voters now depend on high property values for their wealth. Politicians fear that deflating the bubble would cause electoral suicide. So they keep inflating it, praying the crash never comes. Classic managed decline, maintaining appearances while the foundations crumble. And that brings us to Australia's most dangerous gamble yet. How do you hide economic stagnation and keep GDP numbers growing? Simple. Import more people. Australia added roughly 550,000 people through net overseas migration in 2022-23 alone, the highest rate in the developed world. That's like adding a city larger than Canberra every single year. On paper, this creates economic growth. More people means more consumption, more housing demand, higher GDP. But it's the economic equivalent of a Ponzi scheme. All those new arrivals need somewhere to live. But housing construction couldn't keep pace. Only 177,000 new homes were built in 2024 against demand for 223,000. Basic supply and demand flood the market with buyers while limiting supply and prices explode. The immigration surge drove rent increases of double digits annually in major cities. Traffic congestion in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney ranks among the worst globally. Hospital wait times stretch for months. Schools are overcrowded. Infrastructure built for 4 million people now serves 6 million. The quality of life that once made Australia attractive is deteriorating rapidly. But here's the demographic time bomb hiding behind the immigration numbers. Australia's natural birth rate has collapsed to just 1.5 children per woman, well below the 2.1 replacement rate. Young Australian families are choosing between having children and having homes. Many are choosing homes and remaining childless. The population is only growing through immigration. Australia is importing its future population while failing to provide livable conditions for families already there. This is the demographic profile of a declining civilization, unable to reproduce itself, dependent on foreign influx to maintain basic economic functions. Take Sarah and James, both 29, both university graduates working in Sydney. They've been together for 6 years. They want children, but their combined income of $140,000 can barely cover rent on a 2-bedroom apartment 90 minutes from the city center. A house deposit would take them 15 years to save if property prices stopped rising tomorrow. We've basically given up on the idea of kids, Sarah told a housing affordability survey. How can you bring a child into the world when you can't even guarantee you'll have a roof over their head? They're not alone. Fertility clinics report that financial stress is now the leading factor in delayed childbearing. Relationship counselors see couples breaking under the pressure of impossible housing costs. Young men, in particular, report feeling like failures for being unable to provide basic security for their families. The psychological toll is devastating. Suicide rates among Australian men aged 25 to 34 have risen significantly over the past decade. Mental health services report record demand. An entire generation is experiencing what psychologists call learned helplessness, the belief that no amount of hard work will improve their situation. Meanwhile, educated young Australians are leaving the country in record numbers. In 2024, immigration applications hit all-time highs, with skilled workers heading to countries where their degrees still mean something. Australia is experiencing a brain drain, losing the very people who could build its future economy. The human cost of this crisis extends far beyond housing statistics. It's the collapse of the social contract that built modern Australia. And it gets worse when you look at the debt. Australian household debt has exploded to 182% of annual income, among the highest ratios on Earth. The average family owes nearly twice their yearly earnings, mostly on housing loans. Unlike the 1990s recession, when most families had low debt and housing was affordable, today's Australians have zero buffer. An economic shock would hit people where it hurts most, their mortgages and their jobs, with no savings to cushion the blow. Rising interest rates are already crushing over-leveraged families. If unemployment rises or property values fall, it could trigger a cascade of defaults that would devastate the banking system. The scary part? Most Australians have no idea how precarious their situation really is. But what makes this crisis truly unstoppable is what happens when people try to resist. You'd expect mass protests, political upheaval, demands for change. Instead, Australia has seen remarkably little effective resistance. Why? First, distraction. Public discourse floods with cultural battles and identity politics, while the real decisions, housing policy, tax policy, foreign ownership rules, get made quietly in back rooms. Second, normalization. Government reports now openly describe young Australians as a generation of forever renters. Instead of treating this as a crisis to fix, leaders frame it as an acceptable new reality. Third, the people who should be leading the resistance are trapped in the system themselves. Meet the typical Australian politician. Take Anthony Albanese, Australia's Prime Minister. He owns multiple properties worth millions. The housing minister owns investment properties too. The opposition leader, property portfolio. State premiers, investment properties. They're not just failing to fix the housing crisis, they're profiting from it. Every policy that drives up housing prices increases their personal wealth. Negative gearing saves them thousands in taxes. Capital gains exemptions boost their returns. When young Australians demand change, they're asking multimillionaire property investors to vote themselves poorer. It's like asking a casino owner to ban gambling. And it's not just politicians. The business leaders, media commentators, and policy advisors who shape public opinion, they all own multiple properties. The very people with platforms to demand reform have the most to lose from it. This creates a psychological trap. Even voters who can't afford homes often support policies that keep prices high, hoping they might eventually benefit too. It's Stockholm Syndrome on a national scale. Meanwhile, the infrastructure for silencing dissent grows stronger. Australia's 2024 Digital ID Act creates the backbone for comprehensive social monitoring, authority sweeping powers to remove harmful content, which increasingly includes economic criticism that threatens financial stability. During COVID lockdowns, Australia demonstrated its willingness to crush civil liberties when stability was threatened. Protest permits denied, bank accounts frozen for those who donated to unauthorized causes. The precedent is set. The average Australian feels powerless for good reason. Working multiple jobs to pay rent, sitting in traffic for hours commuting from distant suburbs, dealing with rising bills and stagnant wages. They're told it's market forces or globalization, that nothing can be done. This learned helplessness allows the destruction to continue without meaningful resistance. But the real trap isn't psychological, it's structural. The system has been designed to make resistance nearly impossible. But reality has a way of asserting itself, and Australia is approaching the point where all these contradictions explode simultaneously. Here's the nightmare scenario that economists are privately discussing. Global commodity prices soften as China's economy slows. Australia's export revenues plummet. Mining layoffs begin. At the same time, interest rates remain elevated to fight inflation. Heavily indebted households start defaulting on mortgages. Property prices begin falling, first 10%, then 20%, then 30% in bubble areas. Consumer spending contracts as people feel poorer without home equity. Construction halts, employment rises, government revenues collapse as income taxes and property transaction taxes disappear. But here's where the cascade effect becomes truly devastating. Local governments across Australia are already cracking under the strain. For decades, councils funded themselves by selling land to developers at massive markups. When property development stops, their revenue streams vanish overnight. In Queensland, some councils can't afford basic road maintenance. In New South Wales, several regional councils face bankruptcy. Western Australian mining towns that boomed on commodity wealth now struggle to fund essential services as companies pull out. These aren't isolated cases, they're previews of what's coming nationwide. When local governments can't maintain infrastructure, property values fall further. When property values fall, household wealth evaporates. When household wealth disappears, consumer spending collapses. The feedback loop accelerates the destruction. Imagine your suburb when the council can't afford garbage collection, when road repairs stop, when public transport is cut, when libraries and community centers close, when police response times stretch to hours. This is how a developed nation degrades into third world conditions, not through war or natural disaster, but through the slow collapse of basic civic functions. The Australian dollar weakens, making imports expensive and feeding inflation. The Reserve Bank faces an impossible choice: cut rates to help mortgage holders or keep them high to fight inflation. Foreign investors pull money out of Australian markets. The banking system, massively exposed to residential mortgages, faces potential insolvency. It becomes 2008 plus 1990s plus 1970s all at once. Housing crash, banking crisis, commodity bust, and inflation with record debt levels. This would be an economic catastrophe unlike anything Australia has experienced. And unlike other countries that faced similar crises, Australia has burned its bridges. Argentina could devalue its currency. Greece could restructure its debt. Iceland could let its banks fail and start over. Australia's banks are too big to fail, but too big to save. The government lacks the fiscal resources for a comprehensive bailout. Foreign creditors would demand austerity measures that would deepen the recession. The country that thought it was too rich to fail would discover it's too poor to survive. But could it really be that severe? Unlike past downturns, today's Australians have no financial buffer. Household savings rates are very low. Debt levels are astronomical. Most wealth is tied up in illiquid housing. In the 1990s recession, families could fall back on affordable housing markets and low debt levels. Today, a downturn would devastate both jobs and housing simultaneously, with no escape valve. The government would try stimulus, but Australia's public debt is much higher than in 2008. The fiscal firepower is limited. International experience shows that highly leveraged housing bubbles, when they pop, cause years of economic stagnation. Japan's experience in the 1990s lasted decades. Australia has maximized its vulnerability in pursuit of short-term growth. Like a homeowner who kept refinancing to the hilt and spent all the cash while their salary stagnated. The reckoning is inevitable, and Australia's situation is uniquely dangerous because the problems are systemic and slow-burning. There's a dangerous complacency. We'll muddle through, we always have. But every empire that fell thought it was too big to fail. Widening inequality, elites disconnected from reality, fundamental imbalances, populations distracted by spectacle. These were the warning signs throughout history. Australia exhibits all of them. The tragedy is that none of this had to happen. These were policy choices. Negative gearing could be abolished. Foreign ownership could be restricted. Immigration could be slowed to match housing supply. Speculation could be taxed out of existence. But every reform threatens someone's profits. Property developers, foreign investors, wealthy landlords, politicians with investment portfolios. They all benefit from the current system. So the can gets kicked down the road, hoping the crash happens on someone else's watch. The result will be a lost generation of Australians, priced out of home ownership, burdened with debt, unable to start families, watching their country's wealth flow offshore. Australia's story should terrify the rest of the Western world. In Canada, housing prices have reached Australian levels in major cities. The UK faces similar immigration-driven housing pressures. New Zealand's property bubble mirrors Australia's almost exactly. Parts of the United States show identical warning signs. In Ireland, landlords now evict tenants en masse to sell at inflated prices. In the Netherlands, first-time buyers bid against hedge funds for basic apartments. In the U.S., private equity firms like Blackstone buy entire suburban neighborhoods, converting homeownership dreams into rental extraction schemes. This isn't just an Australian issue, it's a global real estate coup. What once were homes are now assets. What once built families now build portfolios. The same script is playing out from Auckland to Austin, from Toronto to Dublin. Local families priced out by international capital. Young professionals competing against algorithmic bidding systems. Entire generations locked out of the stability their parents took for granted. And no one in power knows how to stop it, or wants to. But Australia's crisis serves as a preview of what happens when these imbalances reach their breaking point. The country that once symbolized Western prosperity and opportunity now demonstrates how quickly the middle class can be eliminated. Look at the trajectory. In 2000, a typical Australian family could buy a house on one income. By 2010, it required two incomes. By 2020, two professional incomes weren't enough. By 2025, even dual professional incomes with family help can't compete with foreign cash buyers and domestic speculators. This isn't just economic change, it's social engineering on a massive scale. The elimination of the middle class isn't an accident or an unintended consequence. It's the logical result of policies that prioritize capital gains over wages, speculation over productivity, and foreign investment over domestic prosperity. Other developed nations watching Australia should ask themselves, are we making the same policy choices? Are we allowing our housing to become investment commodities? Are we selling our strategic assets to foreign buyers? Are we using immigration to mask economic stagnation? The answers, unfortunately, are mostly yes. What makes Australia's collapse particularly instructive is how it reveals the endgame of financialized capitalism. When everything becomes a market, housing, education, healthcare, even citizenship, ordinary people get priced out of their own country. The lesson is clear. Wealth on paper means nothing if ordinary families can't afford basic necessities. Economic growth means nothing if all the gains flow to foreign investors and property speculators. A country can look prosperous while its middle class is being systematically destroyed. And once the destruction reaches critical mass, reversal becomes nearly impossible. The political class owns too much property to vote for reform. The wealthy have too much to lose to accept change. The young lack the political power to force action. This is how democracies die, not through coups or revolutions, but through the gradual transfer of wealth and power from citizens to elites, until the majority becomes politically irrelevant. The democratic system remains, but increasingly hollow. Young Australians, despite being the largest demographic, hold the least electoral influence. Homeowners vote at double the rate of renters. Older generations, who already own property, shape housing policy, while younger ones live with the consequences. And when elections come, every major party promises affordability, while their MPs collectively own dozens of investment properties. Liberal, Labor, Greens, they all benefit personally from high house prices. It's political theater, and everyone knows it. This won't be an unpredictable disaster. It will be the logical result of choices made by those in power and tolerated by the population. Tax policies that reward speculation over productivity. Immigration rules that inflate demand while constraining supply. Foreign investment frameworks that prioritize overseas capital over domestic families. They were rational decisions, just not for the people forced to live with them. Australia's story is still being written, but unless dramatic changes come soon, it will be remembered as the rich country that chose to make itself poor, the lucky country that sold its luck to the highest bidder. And when the final accounting is done, historians will ask how a nation blessed with every natural advantage managed to destroy its own prosperity. The answer will be simple. They confused wealth on paper with wealth in reality. They mistook asset bubbles for genuine prosperity. They prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. Australia's collapse is far worse than most people think because it's not a temporary crisis. It's a permanent transfer of wealth and opportunity from Australian families to foreign interests and domestic elites. What do you think? Can Australia still reverse course, or is the damage already irreversible? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this analysis eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Because if Australia can fall this far this fast, no country is safe from the same fate.